Sarah wiped down the same table for the third time, her eyes constantly drifting toward the television mounted in the corner of the bustling restaurant. The news anchor was announcing the final details about tonight's charity concert at the city's most prestigious concert hall. World-renowned pianists, violinists, and opera singers would perform to raise money for children's hospitals across the country. The restaurant buzzed with excitement as wealthy patrons discussed their plans for the evening. Sarah recognized many of them as regular customers who never seemed to worry about money. They ordered expensive wines without checking prices and left tips that sometimes exceeded her daily wage. "Table 12 needs their check," called Maria, another waitress who had become Sarah's closest friend during her 2 years working at Romano's Fine Dining. Sarah nodded and grabbed the leather portfolio, walking toward the corner booth where a distinguished man in his 60s sat alone. Richard Blackwood barely looked up from his phone as Sarah approached. His tailored suit probably cost more than she earned in 6 months, and his gold watch caught the light every time he moved his wrist. As one of the city's most successful real estate moguls, he was accustomed to being recognized wherever he went. "Here's your check, sir," Sarah said politely, placing the portfolio beside his empty plate. The remnants of his $40 steak dinner sat barely touched, something that always bothered her when she thought about her own modest meals at home. Richard glanced at the bill without interest and pulled out a platinum credit card. As he handed it back to Sarah, she noticed something fall from his jacket pocket onto the floor. It was an elegant envelope with gold embossing. "Excuse me, sir, you dropped this," Sarah said, bending to pick up the envelope. As she handed it back, she caught a glimpse of what was inside through the partially open flap. It was a concert ticket for tonight's charity performance. "Thank you," Richard said dismissively, tucking the envelope back into his pocket. He seemed annoyed by the interruption, his attention already returning to his phone calls and business emails. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart racing as an idea formed in her mind. She'd been dreaming about this concert for months, ever since the first advertisements appeared in the newspaper. The performers were artists she had studied and admired since childhood, musicians whose recordings she listened to every night after work. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice your ticket for tonight's concert," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. "I was wondering if there might be any chance you're not planning to use it." Richard looked up from his phone with surprise and mild amusement. A waitress asking about his concert ticket was certainly not something that happened every day. His eyebrows raised as he studied her face, trying to understand what could possibly make her think she belonged at such an exclusive event. "The ticket?" Richard chuckled softly, leaning back in his booth. "Young lady, do you have any idea how much these seats cost? This isn't some local community theater show." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she pressed on. "I understand it's expensive, sir. I've been saving money for months hoping to buy a ticket, but they sold out before I could afford one. I would be willing to work for it, or perform some kind of service in exchange." The suggestion made Richard laugh more openly now, drawing glances from nearby tables. The idea of a restaurant waitress performing any service valuable enough to earn a ticket to the city's most prestigious concert struck him as genuinely amusing. "Perform?" Richard repeated, his tone filled with condescension. "What exactly could you possibly perform that would be worth several $100s?" Other customers began to notice the conversation, their own discussions quieting as they turned to watch the exchange between the wealthy businessman and the young waitress. Sarah felt dozens of eyes on her, but something inside her refused to back down. The concert hall would be filled with the most talented musicians in the world, and she knew she belonged there not as a spectator in cheap seats, but as someone who understood music at the deepest level. Her fingers unconsciously moved against her apron, practicing scales she had performed thousands of times on pianos far better than most people would ever touch. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands steady despite the dozens of curious eyes watching her every move. The restaurant had grown quieter, with even the kitchen staff peeking through the service window to see what was happening at table 12. "I can play piano," Sarah said simply, her voice gaining confidence. "If there's a piano anywhere in this restaurant, I'll play something for you. If you think it's good enough, maybe you could consider letting me use your ticket." Richard's expression shifted from amusement to outright disbelief. He glanced around the restaurant as if looking for hidden cameras, convinced this must be some kind of elaborate joke. The idea that a waitress could play piano well enough to earn anything seemed absurd to him. Piano? Richard laughed again, but this time there was a sharper edge to his voice. Even if this place had a piano, which it doesn't, what makes you think you could play anything worth hearing? Have you taken a few lessons at the local community center? Maria approached the table nervously, sensing the tension building in the conversation. She had worked alongside Sarah for 2 years, but had never heard her mention anything about playing piano. Like everyone else in the restaurant, she was curious to see how this unusual situation would unfold. Actually, interrupted Romano himself, the restaurant owner who rarely left his office upstairs, there is a piano here. We have an old upright in the back room that we use sometimes for special events. The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through the restaurant. Romano was a heavy-set man in his 70s who had built his restaurant from nothing over 30 years ago. He had been watching the conversation from across the room and decided to intervene. You want to give her a chance to embarrass herself publicly? Richard asked, his tone suggesting he found the whole situation entertaining rather than annoying. Fine, but when she plays Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with 2 fingers, I don't want to hear any complaints. Romano nodded to 2 of his staff members, who disappeared into the back room and began moving furniture around. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor echoed through the restaurant, followed by the distinctive sound of piano keys being tested. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she untied her apron and handed it to Maria. Her friend squeezed her hand supportively, though worry was clearly visible in her eyes. Most of the restaurant's patrons had stopped eating entirely, sensing they were about to witness something unusual. What exactly are you planning to play? Richard asked, settling back into his seat as if preparing for a show. Please don't tell me it's chopsticks or some simple church hymn. I was thinking Chopin, Sarah replied quietly, rolling up her sleeves and flexing her fingers. Maybe the Ballade No. 1 in G minor, if that's all right with you. The suggestion caused several gasps from the more musically educated patrons in the restaurant. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 was not a piece that amateur pianists typically attempted. It required technical skill, emotional depth, and years of serious study to perform properly. Richard's eyebrows shot up with surprise, but his skeptical expression remained unchanged. You do realize that piece takes nearly 10 minutes to perform and requires advanced technical skill? Are you sure you don't want to choose something a little more manageable? I'm sure, Sarah said, walking toward the back room where the staff had finished setting up the old upright piano. The instrument looked like it had seen better days, with scratched wood and keys that showed years of use, but it appeared to be in working condition. As Sarah sat down at the piano bench, she noticed her hands were trembling slightly. She had not performed in front of an audience for over 3 years, not since she had been forced to leave music school when her family ran out of money to pay tuition. The restaurant fell completely silent, except for the soft sounds of the kitchen and the distant traffic outside. Even the servers stopped moving, standing frozen with plates and glasses in their hands as they waited to see what would happen next. Sarah placed her fingers on the keys and closed her eyes for a moment. Remembering all the hours she had spent practicing this exact piece in tiny practice rooms and on her grandmother's old piano, she thought about her dreams of performing on the world's greatest stages. Dreams she had been forced to put aside to pay rent and buy groceries. When she opened her eyes, she looked directly at Richard Blackwood, whose expression had shifted from amusement to curiosity. He leaned forward slightly despite himself, as Sarah began to play the first haunting notes of one of classical music's most challenging and beautiful compositions. The first notes floated through the restaurant like silk, immediately silencing even the skeptics who had expected an embarrassing amateur performance. Sarah's fingers moved across the keys with the fluid precision of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting every phrase, every subtle dynamic change that made Chopin's music so emotionally powerful. Richard felt his smug expression fade as the opening melody unfolded with unexpected beauty. This was not the fumbling attempt he had anticipated. The young waitress was playing with genuine skill, her fingers navigating the complex passages with confidence and grace. Around the restaurant, conversations stopped mid-sentence. A businessman who had been arguing loudly on his phone hung up without explanation. A couple who had been complaining about their delayed appetizers forgot their irritation entirely. Even the kitchen staff had stopped cooking to listen, standing in the doorway with wonder written across their faces. Sarah lost herself in the music, her body swaying naturally with the flowing melody. The old piano, despite its worn appearance, responded beautifully to her touch. She had learned to make music on far worse instruments, practicing on keyboards missing keys and pianos so out of tune, they were barely playable. As the piece moved into its more technically demanding sections, Sarah's playing became even more impressive. Her left hand provided a solid foundation, while her right hand danced through passages that required years of serious study to master. The complex rhythms and rapid-scale passages flowed effortlessly, each note placed with mathematical precision yet infused with genuine emotion. Richard found himself leaning forward, his phone forgotten on the table. He had attended dozens of classical concerts over the years, usually for business or social reasons rather than genuine appreciation. But he recognized exceptional talent when he heard it, and this young woman was delivering a performance that belonged on a professional stage. Maria watched her friend with tears forming in her eyes. In 2 years of working together, Sarah had never mentioned her musical background. Now she understood why Sarah always seemed slightly out of place in the restaurant, why she sometimes hummed complex melodies while cleaning tables, why she always requested to work the early shift so she could have evenings free. The middle section of the piece showcased Sarah's interpretive maturity as well as her technical skill. She brought out inner voices in the harmony that many pianists missed, creating layers of meaning that revealed deep understanding of the composer's intentions. Her phrasing was sophisticated, with subtle rubato that enhanced the emotional impact without disrupting the musical structure. Several patrons pulled out their phones to record the performance, sensing they were witnessing something special. A young couple at a corner table moved their chairs closer together, the music transforming their casual dinner into something unexpectedly romantic. An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, the melody apparently triggering powerful memories. As the piece approached its dramatic climax, Sarah's playing intensified without becoming harsh or aggressive. Her years of classical training showed in her ability to produce a full, rich sound from the old upright piano, drawing every possible ounce of music from the limited instrument. Richard glanced around the restaurant and realized that every single person was completely captivated. Servers stood motionless with water pitchers in their hands. Customers sat with forks halfway to their mouths, their dinners forgotten. Even Romano himself had emerged from the kitchen to listen, his usual stern expression replaced by obvious amazement. The technical demands of the final section were considerable, requiring rapid octaves, complex chord progressions, and precise timing. Sarah navigated these challenges flawlessly, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the kind of speed and accuracy that took decades to develop. Yet the music never sounded mechanical or overly technical. It remained deeply expressive throughout. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, the restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. The final passages required delicate control, bringing the emotional intensity down from its peak while maintaining the musical tension until the very last note. Sarah played the closing measures with exquisite sensitivity, allowing each note to resonate fully before moving to the next. The final chord hung in the air for several seconds after she lifted her hands from the keys, the sound gradually fading into complete silence. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The transformation from noisy restaurant to concert hall had been so complete that the sudden return to reality felt jarring. Then, almost simultaneously, the entire restaurant erupted in spontaneous applause, with several people rising to their feet in appreciation of what they had just witnessed. The applause thundered through the restaurant for nearly a full minute, with some patrons calling out "Bravo" and "Magnificent." Sarah sat at the piano bench, slightly dazed by the overwhelming response. She had not expected such a reaction from a room full of strangers who had simply come for dinner. Richard remained in his seat, staring at Sarah with an expression that had completely transformed from condescending amusement to genuine shock. He had attended performances by world-class musicians and recognized that what he had just heard belonged in any major concert hall. This was not the dabbling of a talented amateur. This was the playing of a serious artist. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Richard asked as the applause finally died down. His voice had lost all traces of mockery and condescension, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. Sarah stood up from the piano bench, smoothing down her uniform skirt as she walked back toward his table. The restaurant patrons continued to watch her with new eyes. as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "I studied at Juilliard for 3 years," Sarah said quietly, settling back into her role as his server despite everything that had just happened. "I had to leave when my family couldn't afford the tuition anymore. That was 4 years ago." The admission sent murmurs through the nearby tables as people began to understand the full significance of what they had witnessed. Juilliard was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world, accepting only the most gifted students from thousands of applicants. "You were a student at Juilliard?" Richard repeated, his business mind immediately grasping the implications. Students at that institution were typically destined for major performing careers. "What were you studying?" "Performance. Piano performance and composition," Sarah confirmed, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of discussing her abandoned dreams. "I was supposed to graduate last year. I had already been accepted into several master's programs, but everything changed when my father had his heart attack and lost his job." Maria approached the table with tears still visible in her eyes, carrying Sarah's apron. She had worked alongside her friend for 2 years without knowing any of this history, and the revelation explained so many small details she had never fully understood. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Maria whispered, handing Sarah the apron. "I mean about your training? About Juilliard? What was the point?" Sarah replied with a sad smile. "It doesn't change anything. I still need to pay rent, buy groceries, help support my parents. Talking about what I used to do just makes it harder to focus on what I need to do now." Richard pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, his mind racing with possibilities. As a successful businessman, he had learned to recognize exceptional talent in any field, and he was looking at someone whose abilities were being completely wasted. "Have you kept up with your playing?" Richard asked, looking up from his phone. "I mean, do you still practice, study new pieces?" "Every night after work," Sarah admitted. "There's a church a few blocks from my apartment that lets me use their piano in the evenings. The pastor knows about my situation and has been very kind. I practice for 2 or 3 hours every night just to stay sharp." The dedication required to maintain such skills while working full-time as a waitress was staggering. Richard began to understand the sacrifices this young woman had made and continued to make for her art. Most people would have given up entirely under such circumstances. "What about performance opportunities?" Richard pressed. "Surely there must be local venues, community orchestras, something where you could play professionally." Sarah shook her head. "I've applied to everything within 50 miles of here. Community orchestras, church positions, teaching jobs, accompanist work. But most places want someone with a completed degree, or they pay so little that I can't afford to take the time away from restaurant work." Romano approached the table, still looking amazed by what he had witnessed. Several of his regular customers had already approached him asking why he had been hiding such an extraordinary performer in his restaurant. "Sarah," Romano said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "I had no idea about your background. If I had known, I would have found ways for you to perform here regularly. We could have piano nights, special events." "That's very kind, Mr. Romano," Sarah replied. "But I can't afford to work fewer shifts, even for something I love." Richard looked at the ticket in his hand, then back at Sarah. The entire evening had been a revelation that challenged his assumptions about talent, opportunity, and the barriers that prevented extraordinary people from reaching their potential. He was beginning to formulate an idea that could change everything for this remarkable young woman. "Sarah," Richard said slowly, "I think we need to have a more serious conversation, not here and not about just one concert ticket. There might be opportunities you haven't considered, people who should hear about your situation." Richard gestured for Sarah to sit across from him in the booth, his entire demeanor having transformed from dismissive businessman to someone genuinely interested in solving a problem. The other restaurant patrons had gradually returned to their meals, though many continued glancing in their direction with obvious curiosity. "Before we discuss anything else," Richard said, sliding the concert ticket across the table, "this belongs to you now. That performance more than earned it." He paused, studying her face carefully. "But I suspect one evening of music isn't really what you need." Sarah stared at the elegant ticket, hardly daring to believe it was real. The concert started in just 2 hours, featuring musicians she had studied and admired throughout her years at Juilliard. Yet Richard's words suggested something even more significant might be developing. I don't understand, Sarah said softly, picking up the ticket with trembling fingers. What do you mean about what I need? Richard leaned forward, his business instincts fully engaged. I mean that someone with your talent shouldn't be serving dinner to people who can't appreciate what they're looking at. I've been in business long enough to recognize exceptional ability, and I've also learned that talent without opportunity is just wasted potential. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, finding several names that could prove crucial to Sarah's future. As a major philanthropist and board member of several cultural organizations, Richard had connections throughout the music world that most people could only dream of accessing. I sit on the board of the City Symphony Orchestra, Richard continued, and I know they've been looking for a new pianist for their educational outreach programs. It's not a full-time position yet, but it pays well and would give you performance experience while you work toward bigger opportunities. Sarah felt her heart racing as she tried to process what he was suggesting. Professional performance opportunities had seemed completely out of reach just an hour ago, and now this stranger was offering to help her access them. There's more, Richard said, warming to his theme. The Blackwood Foundation, which my company sponsors, provides scholarships for gifted students who need financial assistance to complete their education. We could arrange funding for you to finish your degree at Juilliard, assuming they would readmit you. I couldn't possibly accept charity, Sarah began, but Richard held up his hand to stop her. This isn't charity, Richard corrected firmly. This is investment. The foundation invests in people who have the potential to make significant contributions to their fields. Based on what I just heard, you definitely qualify. Maria had been listening from nearby, pretending to clean tables while actually following every word of the conversation. The possibility that her friend might escape the exhausting cycle of restaurant work and financial stress seemed almost too good to be true. What would you expect in return? Sarah asked cautiously. Her years of financial struggle had taught her to be suspicious of offers that seemed too generous to be real. Eventually, when you're established in your career, you would help other young musicians the same way, Richard explained. Maybe through teaching, maybe through your own charitable work, maybe by serving on the foundation board yourself someday. We call it paying it forward. Sarah looked around the restaurant where she had spent the last 2 years of her life, serving meals to people who never saw her as anything more than part of the background scenery. The contrast between this familiar environment and the possibilities Richard was describing felt almost surreal. There's one other thing, Richard added, checking his watch. Tonight's charity concert isn't just a performance, it's also a major fundraising event. Many of the city's most influential patrons of the arts will be there, including people who make decisions about hiring musicians for professional positions. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Sarah. This is my personal number. If you're serious about rebuilding your career, call me tomorrow morning. I'll set up meetings with the right people. Sarah studied the business card, recognizing Richard's company name as one of the most successful real estate firms in the state. The magnitude of the opportunity he was offering began to sink in as she realized how many doors his influence could open. Why are you doing this? Sarah asked, still struggling to believe the evening's dramatic turn of events. You don't know anything about me except what you heard in one performance. Richard smiled, and for the first time all evening, his expression showed genuine warmth instead of business calculation. Because 30 years ago someone took a chance on a young man who had big dreams but no connections and limited resources. I've never forgotten what that opportunity meant to me. He stood up from the booth and put on his coat, preparing to leave for his own evening plans. The difference is you have far more talent than I ever did. You just need someone to open the right doors. Sarah clutched the concert ticket and business card, her mind reeling with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider in years. The path back to her musical dreams, which had seemed permanently closed, was suddenly opening in ways she never could have imagined. Sarah stood outside the grand concert hall 90 minutes later, wearing the only dress she owned that seemed appropriate for such an elegant venue. The black dress was simple but well-fitted, something she had bought years ago for her Juilliard auditions and had carefully preserved through all the financial difficulties that followed. The building itself was magnificent, with marble columns and crystal chandeliers visible through the tall windows. Well-dressed patrons streamed through the entrance, their expensive clothes and confident bearing marking them as members of the city's cultural elite. Sarah felt momentarily intimidated, wondering if she truly belonged in such rarefied company. Inside the lobby, she presented her ticket to an usher, who glanced at it with surprise and obvious respect. The seat Richard had given her was in the third row of the orchestra section, close enough to see every expression on the performers' faces. Such seats typically cost more than Sarah earned in a month. As she settled into the plush velvet seat, Sarah recognized several faces around her from newspaper society pages and arts coverage. These were the people who funded symphonies, sponsored music competitions, and made the decisions about which artists received career-launching opportunities. The program included works by Mozart, Rachmaninoff, and Chopin, performed by musicians whose recordings Sarah had studied for years. As the lights dimmed and the first performer took the stage, she felt transported back to her student days when such concerts had been a regular part of her education. The opening Mozart sonata was performed flawlessly, with technical precision and interpretive sophistication that reminded Sarah of everything she had loved about classical music. But as she listened, she found herself analyzing the performance from a professional perspective, noting choices she might have made differently and passages she could have executed with equal skill. During intermission, Sarah noticed Richard Blackwood across the lobby, engaged in animated conversation with several distinguished-looking individuals. When he spotted her, he excused himself from his group and walked over with a warm smile. "I'm so glad you could make it," Richard said, gesturing toward his companions. "I've been telling some friends about your performance this evening. They're very interested in meeting you." Before Sarah could respond, Richard had guided her across the lobby to where three people stood waiting with obvious curiosity. The first was an elegantly dressed woman in her 50s who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Patricia Morrison," Richard said. "She's the director of artistic programming for the City Symphony Orchestra." Patricia extended her hand with genuine interest, her eyes studying Sarah with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent decades evaluating musical talent. "Richard tells me you gave quite a performance this evening. Where did you train?" "Juilliard," Sarah replied, still feeling slightly overwhelmed by the situation, "though I wasn't able to complete my degree due to family circumstances." "I see," Patricia said thoughtfully. "And you've been maintaining your skills despite working outside the music profession? That shows remarkable dedication." The second person Richard introduced was Dr. James Chen, a professor of music at the local university, who also served as a guest conductor for several regional orchestras. He was particularly interested in Sarah's background in both performance and composition. "We've been looking for someone to teach private lessons and occasional master classes," Dr. Chen explained. "The position requires high-level skills but offers flexible scheduling, which might work well if you're transitioning back into professional music." The third member of the group was Margaret Whitfield, an elderly woman whose family foundation had been supporting young musicians for over 50 years. She listened intently as Sarah described her background and current situation, asking thoughtful questions about her goals and aspirations. "The Whitfield Foundation has a program specifically designed for musicians in situations like yours," Margaret said. "We provide financial support, performance opportunities, and mentorship connections. Several of our scholarship recipients have gone on to major international careers." As the lobby lights flickered to signal the end of intermission, Sarah realized that this brief conversation had generated more professional opportunities than she had encountered in the past 4 years combined. The contrast between her morning serving breakfast and her evening discussing career prospects with industry leaders felt almost dreamlike. "We should continue this conversation in a more formal setting," Patricia said, handing Sarah her business card. "Why don't you call my office next week to set up an audition? We have several upcoming projects that might be perfect for someone with your background." As they returned to their seats for the second half of the concert, Sarah felt a profound sense of possibility that she hadn't experienced since leaving school. The musicians on stage were no longer distant figures she could only admire from afar. They were colleagues whose world she might soon re-enter. The final performance was a challenging Rachmaninoff concerto that showcased both technical brilliance and deep emotional expression. As Sarah listened, she imagined herself performing such works again, not in the back room of a restaurant for an audience of surprised diners, but on stages like this one, sharing music with people who understood its power to transform lives. 6 months later, Sarah walked across the stage of the same concert hall where her life had begun to change, this time as a featured soloist with the City Symphony Orchestra. The black dress she wore was new, purchased with earnings from her teaching position and part-time work as a rehearsal pianist. But more importantly, it represented a life where music was once again her primary focus rather than a distant dream. The audience applauded as she took her seat at the grand piano, a magnificent Steinway that responded to her touch with the kind of sensitivity and power she had dreamed of playing during her years at the restaurant. In the third row, she spotted Richard Blackwood, who had become not just a benefactor, but a genuine friend and mentor. Her performance that evening was the culmination of months of intensive preparation, working with Patricia Morrison and the symphony to perfect a challenging concerto that showcased both her technical skills and her artistic maturity. The piece was broadcast live on the local classical music radio station, marking Sarah's official return to the professional music world. As the orchestra began the opening measures, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness that had been missing from her life for years. This was where she belonged, sharing music with people who understood its power to touch hearts and minds in ways that mere words could never achieve. The performance was flawless, earning a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. But beyond the immediate success of the evening, Sarah knew that this concert represented something much more significant. Proof that talent combined with opportunity could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. After the performance, Sarah was surrounded by congratulatory audience members, fellow musicians, and representatives from several major music organizations. The local newspaper's music critic approached for an interview, and she learned that a recording company executive in the audience had expressed interest in discussing future projects. During the reception following the concert, Margaret Whitfield approached with exciting news. Sarah had been selected to receive the foundation's most prestigious scholarship, which would cover the remaining costs of her Juilliard education and provide a generous living stipend while she completed her degree. "We believe you have the potential for a truly exceptional career," Margaret said warmly. "But more than that, we think you understand the importance of helping others achieve their dreams once you've achieved your own." Dr. Chen offered Sarah a permanent position on the university faculty, teaching advanced piano and occasionally conducting masterclasses for gifted students. The position would provide stability and allow her to share her knowledge with the next generation of musicians. Patricia Morrison had even more ambitious plans in mind. The symphony was planning a major tour next season, and she wanted Sarah to be featured as soloist in several cities. Such exposure could launch her toward the kind of international career that most musicians only dream of achieving. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself alone with Richard for a moment. Looking out at the city lights from the concert hall's elegant lobby, the transformation from waitress to professional musician still felt surreal, but she was beginning to accept that her life had genuinely changed. "I still can't quite believe this is real," Sarah admitted, fingering the business cards she had collected throughout the evening. 6 months ago, I thought my musical career was permanently over. Talent has a way of finding opportunities, Richard replied thoughtfully. But it often needs someone willing to take that first chance. I'm just glad I was in the right place at the right time to recognize what I was hearing. Sarah nodded, thinking about all the small decisions and coincidences that had led to this moment. If she hadn't worked that particular shift, if Richard hadn't dropped his ticket, if she hadn't found the courage to ask for a chance to perform, her life might have continued on its previous trajectory indefinitely. "I have something for you," Sarah said, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. Inside was a recording she had made of the Chopin piece she had played in the restaurant, along with several other works she had been practicing during her years away from professional music. "This is how I want to remember where this all started," Sarah explained. "And I want you to know that I'll never forget what you did for me, or the responsibility that comes with having been given such an opportunity." As they parted ways that evening, both understood that this was not an ending but a beginning. Sarah's return to the music world was just the first step in what promised to be a remarkable journey, one that would eventually allow her to provide the same kind of life-changing opportunities for other talented musicians facing seemingly impossible circumstances. The restaurant where she had worked for 2 years still displayed a small, framed photo from the newspaper article about her symphony debut, inspiring other employees to pursue their own dreams with renewed hope and determination.